Thank you, Nancy. Hello, I'm Ivana Vidakovic, a Senior Research Manager at Cambridge English Language Assessment.
And I'm Dennis Carr, a Senior Assessment Manager at Cambridge English Language Assessment. Welcome to the fourth in a series of 6 webinars of Understanding Assessment. Today we'll try to help you understand some of the key ideas about reading assessment and give you practical tips. Whichever skill you are assessing, you should know why and who you are testing, so you should be aware of test purpose and test takers, as well as being aware of the impact of the test on your learners. Today we will address 3 questions. The first one is, what am I testing? This refers to the skill being tested. The technical term for this is test construct. We will then move on to the question of, how am I testing? This refers to the tasks in the test. We will end with the question, how am I scoring? This refers to how to go about assigning marks to the performance of the test takers. We'll focus on criteria for assessing responses to reading tasks, weighting, and how we can make sure that the tests are fair. Let's start with a question. What should you be aware of when creating a reading task or a test of reading? Please share your ideas in the chat box. Here's the question again. What should you be aware of when creating a reading task or a test of reading? Just waiting for some of your comments to load up. Oh, Victoria's coming in with the level of students, and of course that's very important. And Michelle with overall level. Oh gosh, they're flashing in so quickly, it's hard to keep a track. Levels coming through. Yes, level seems to be very, very strong. I did notice time flash by as well. And sub-skills. So, you seem to be mentioning ideas related to level, to sub-skills and time. Here are the things that I'd like to look at. The aspects of the skill to assess, the characteristics of students, for example, age, background knowledge, language proficiency, characteristics of reading passages, texts, the advantages and disadvantages of different task types, scoring questions which require students to write an answer, and assessing students at different levels of ability. We will touch upon all these questions in our webinar today.
Let's start with looking at what am I testing? In other words, which features of reading am I aiming to test? Or which reading skills am I eliciting? Here are a few quick questions for you to answer. How do you read in real life? Which reading sub-skills do you use when you read a timetable, for example? Please write your ideas in the chat box now. So which reading skills do you use when you read a timetable? So we're still waiting for some answers. Scanning, yeah. Looking for specific information. Scanning, exactly, yeah. I think you're all quite unanimous. Looking for information, yeah. Thank you very much. So you're looking selectively for specific information, what time the bus or train leaves. So this would be scanning. How about this one? Which reading skills do you use when you read a newspaper? Is it A, skimming for the main points, B, reading carefully for details, C, predicting what the text will be about, or D, scanning to find a particular name or figure, or E, all of the above? Please vote now using the polling buttons. So which reading skills or sub-skills do you use when you read a newspaper? Skimming, looking for specific information. Scanning and skimming, it's true. Okay, let's see. Most of you are saying all of the above and skimming quite a lot, but yeah, I think we would agree on this as well.
Yes.
Regardless of the language you're reading in, you would do those similar things. So it could involve any of all those skills. And what about this one? Which reading skills do you use when you read a poem? Write your ideas in the chat box now, please. So, how do you read a poem? Now let's see. Still waiting for some responses. It all depends on your purpose. Inferring, searching for reading for detail or reading in depth, reading for rhythm, beauty, specific information for analysis, exactly if you're a student. So yeah, you could be reading for pleasure, for detail, or possibly trying to analyze the deeper meaning of the poem. So again, you would be using a variety of skills or sub-skills. In a nutshell, we can differentiate between careful reading, which is linear and slow, allowing the reader to arrive at accurate comprehension of the main ideas and supporting detail, and fast reading. Fast reading could involve firstly skimming for gist, and secondly scanning, looking for exact matches of specific words or phrases, figures, percentages, names, etc., and dismissing any part of the text that does not contain the pre-selected symbol. Thirdly, search reading, which is more challenging than scanning and involves a quick search for detailed information and looking for a particular meaning rather than a specific word. Here is a task for you. You can find this task in your handout, which type of reading. This is Participants Activity 1. Look at the example, either on screen or on the handout, and tell us which type of reading is tested by these two questions. Please note that you are just provided with task instructions and questions, and not a reading passage. Please type in your responses now. So which type of reading would you have to use to respond to these questions? Reading in depth, skimming, scanning for keywords, fast reading, scanning and skimming and reading for detailed meaning. Again, yeah, fast reading, reading for with a purpose. Yeah. Scanning, well, I think we kind of mostly agree that it's fast reading and scanning. So it is really an example of a task-tested scanning. Students need to quickly look through several texts, searching for specific words, such as theatre, or symbols, such as a percentage sign. Here's another task again, and it's on the handout, which type of reading. Please see Participants Activity number 2. Again, you're not provided with a reading text. Can you tell which type of reading is tested through these questions? Please just type in the chat box and tell us which type of reading would you employ to answer those questions. So, reading for gist, skimming, reading for specific information, scanning, inferencing, slow reading, careful and slow, looking for specific information and reading for depth. Okay, we've got all the variety of answers. So, the type of fast reading tested here is search reading. Here, the reader needs to find information on predetermined topics by sampling relevant words, sentences, or important paragraphs. Here's the third task, also on the handout, which type of reading, and this is Participants Activity 3. Tell us which type of fast reading is tested here. Again, you have task instructions in the question, but not the reading text. So please tell us which type of reading would you use here. Okay, reading for gist, quite a lot of responses around reading for gist and skimming. This is correct, yeah. The type of reading tested here is skimming. A learner is given a long passage and a short amount of time to get an idea of what the whole text is about. The reader needs to get the idea of a gist based on as few details from the text as possible. And finally, what kind of reading is tested here? Look at Participants Activity 4 on the handout. Please look at Participants Activity 4 and tell us what type of reading is tested here. Okay, let me just see. Are we getting responses to this item, to these questions? So skimming for gist and fast reading, some people say. Inferring, reading for detail. choosing, looking for specific information, a lot of inferencing, looking for detailed information, understanding detailed information, accuracy, reading for accuracy. Yeah, so this is careful reading. A learner will need to read the text carefully to accurately understand detail. So we've looked at some different kinds of tasks which encourage both fast and careful reading. Let's think for a minute about practicing these skills. Careful reading is needed at all proficiency levels, but in day-to-day life we also need to be able to read quickly. However, at lower proficiency levels, learners may not be able to automatically recognize letter-sound correspondences and blend them into words. Much of their attention is focused on decoding. This process should become automatic before we expect learners to read quickly. So fast reading can be introduced to classroom and assessment activities at an intermediate level, B1 level on the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or the CEFR, and it should receive a more intense focus from B2 level upwards. Bear in mind that some types of fast reading are more challenging than others, so introduce scanning, searching for exact word matches in a text, as a less challenging type of fast reading at B1 level on the CFR. From B2 onwards, teach them more challenging types of fast reading, such as skimming for gist and searching for predetermined information. You'll need to practice both careful and fast reading with your students and also practice switching between the two in a single task. So we've talked about part of the test construct, the different types of reading that we need to test. Now let's think about some of the other skills that readers use to read effectively. When we read, we process different levels of information, and you can see this chart on your handout. What do we do when we read? At the lowest level, we recognize letters and understand words. Then we understand the basic meaning of a phrase and of a whole sentence. Next, we understand the meaning which is not explicitly present in the sentence, a meaning which is implied, so we read between the lines. We then understand or build meaning across sentences and a paragraph. We understand information across a whole text. And finally, we can understand and combine information across several texts. There is a progression in terms of cognitive challenge, which is why reading tests may differ in the coverage of these cognitive processes. In a moment, we will see how tasks can differ in terms of cognitive challenge and the key cognitive processes. But it is important to add that skilled readers do not just begin reading by focusing on individual words. In addition to building meaning from the level of words to the level of a whole text or texts, skilled readers also set goals in terms of how they will read a text. That is, they decide which reading subskill or subskills they will use. They draw on their knowledge of the world or the topic in order to predict what the text will be about. Then they monitor their own comprehension as they read. And they also reread sections of the text to check understanding if they think they may have misunderstood. Let's see if you can apply your knowledge of cognitive processes to this task. Please read the extract of a poem on the screen and answer the question which follows it. Some of this is English, but other words are a made-up language. Even so, you should be able to answer the question by using your knowledge of English. So just read it through quickly and see if you can answer. The extract is also on your handout. Which cognitive processes? So the question is, what did the toves do? And A, they waved. B, they jarred and jimbled. And C, they brilligged. So please choose your response. So please use the poll rather than the chat box. So most of you say they jarred and jimbled, which is B. Some of you say they waved, they brilligged. So 96% of you said B. That's the correct answer. Looking at the same stanza, which word describes the wreaths? Find the word in the poem and type it into the chat, please. So, which word describes the wreaths? Please write in the chat box. Okay, I'm still waiting for the answers to come through. I think I'm still getting the responses from the previous one. Mome, yes. Mome,
Seems
in most
solidly
cases.
moan, yeah.
Exactly. So we would agree as well.
Yes.
Based on the meaning we've built. Thank you very much. You've arrived at correct answers to those two questions because you used your knowledge of sentence structure in English. So this required some understanding of the basic meaning of phrases and sentences. Here is the next part of the poem Jabberwocky from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. And this is also on your handout, Which Cognitive Processes. Please read the next two stanzas of the poem and answer the following question. What did the son in this poem intend to do? A. He intended to play with the Jabberwock. B. He intended to take a nap under the tam-tam tree. And C. He intended to attack the Jabberwock. So please read the two stanzas and pick your response in the poll, please. Okay, so most of you, 89% rising, answered C. He intended to attack the Jabberwock. Yeah, and this is the correct answer, C. You arrived at the correct answer because you used your inferencing skills. You read between the lines to understand what is implied. And finally, let's see which level of cognitive processing this task requires. Feel free to look at the chart on the handout. What do we do when we read? To remind yourself of the different levels in cognitive processing. So this task is also on the handout, Which Cognitive Processes, as participants activity number 5. So what is the key level of cognitive processing required by this task? Use the chart on the handout to help you. We're still waiting for answers. Comparing texts, comparing and contrasting information. Exactly, comparing opinions, understanding information across the whole text and combining information across texts. Correct. Thank you very much. So this task requires understanding and combining meaning across texts. The test taker needs to create a mental representation of all 4 texts and be able to compare and contrast across the texts in order to arrive at correct answers. Looking back at the 4 tasks we've just considered, which one do you think is the most challenging? And please select your response. Task 1, Task 2, Task 3 or Task 4. So we began by understanding words and sentences. Task 3 was about inferencing or reading between the lines, and Task 4 was about cross-text comprehension. So please pick the most challenging one for you. And please use the poll. So most of you, some 87% responded Task 4 is the most challenging, so combining and contrasting information across several texts, and some of you indicated it's the inferencing task. I think these are the most frequent responses, first Task 4 and then Task 3. So I would kind of agree. I mean,
I think so. I think that, for different people things are difficult, but I'd say 4 and 3 are the two most challenging.
Most challenging, I'd say so. So it's typically easier to understand explicit meaning at the level of word, phrase or sentence than to look beyond the text and understand implicit information, or to understand information across a paragraph, a whole text or several texts. In view of what we have discussed so far, let's think about how you can practice, with your students, the skills that will turn them into skilled readers. Constantly work on increasing your learners' vocabulary and grammatical knowledge, because both are crucial for comprehension. And in day-to-day and assessment situations, we may need to search for meaning rather than exact word matches, so it is useful to be able to understand paraphrase. Therefore, teach your students how to understand the same information expressed in different ways. Sometimes it will be necessary to understand information that is not explicitly mentioned in the text, so create tasks which will require learners to read between the lines. Your learners will also need to be able to distinguish between the main idea of a text or paragraph and the information which is given to support that idea. They need to be able to identify how text is structured, so what grammatical, lexical and semantic devices does the writer use. And finally, they should learn how to compare the information within one text as well as across different texts, identifying similarities and differences. You could also encourage learners to be strategic about how they approach a reading task and improve their metacognitive skills. You could, for example, encourage them to predict what the text will be about. Prediction is useful as it can make understanding a text easier and faster. Your students could use the task instructions, the title, or their own knowledge of the world to help them make predictions. Also, the parts of the text a learner has read so far can help predict what will come next. Next, you could teach learners to set goals. Learners should begin to ask themselves questions like, how should I read this text? Carefully, quickly, both? Am I required to pull information from the entire text rather than just from one sentence or a paragraph? And how can I use clues in the questions? So let's look at a question as an example. The question, how did the writer's attitude change during the passage, informs the reader that there has been a change in attitude and that one should read the whole text or a large part of it in order to answer the question correctly. Also, emphasize how important it is for learners to monitor their own understanding and to reread words, sentences or sections when necessary. However, it is also important to teach them not to spend too much time on unfamiliar words, but to identify whether the word is important or not, and to try to understand the gist of the whole sentence, just as you did with the Jabberwocky poem.
So far, we've talked about what reading is and how we read. Let's now think about how we go about eliciting the various different sub-skills of reading in a test. The question here is, how am I testing? And the focus is on the types of tasks and texts we can use. Let's begin with texts and discuss the differences between the texts themselves. Firstly, what do you usually read in English or another language? Please write some of the suggestions in the chat box now. So what I'd like is just, what do you usually read in English or in other languages? And if you put your answers in the chat box, that would be very good. Newspapers, of course, novels. It's flashing by. Brandon, I'll just... It's very difficult to track, yes.
Yeah.
Novels, yes. I mean, there's a wide range of text that we do read. So, could we ask learners to read similar texts in a test? Now, here on the slide, you can see some of the possible text types. Extracts from books, both fiction and non-fiction, and newspapers and magazine articles. These are all quite predictable. But we can also use advertisements and public signs or notices. Another text type is informational material. By that I mean brochures, guides, manuals, that kind of thing. And we can use correspondence, emails, text messages and letters and so on. And there are other text types I'm sure you've come across. The demands of a particular task in a test need to be similar to those in real life, so that we can draw parallels from how someone performs on a test to how they will perform when reading in real life. This is why authentic text from a variety of sources can be used in a test, with some necessary adaptations. Here's another question for you. What are the differences between the types of the material you read? Now, for example, length could be one difference if you're comparing a newspaper article with a note from your partner about buying some groceries. Please write some of the other ideas in the chat box now. Here's the question again. What are the differences between the types of material you read? We've got length coming through, style, of course, register, target audience, lexical differences, register coming through again, and style, genre, scope. So length, as I mentioned, before, but also the style of writing may be different. This mainly refers to the difference in formality between text and the relationship between the writer and the reader. The kind of language used is also important. For example, comparing a doctor's language in a prescription, where there may be some medical jargon, with an academic article on a scientific process. There may also be differences depending on the purpose for which something is written. It could be for information, for entertainment, for instruction, for making contact with others, and so on. The subject matter could be treated differently, for example. An article bringing up children could be very specialised, or it could be general in tone. Similarly, a text giving information could treat a subject in a concrete or more abstract way. And finally, the way the text is structured could vary considerably, from note form to highly connected prose, as in novels, for example. Clearly, it's important to bear in mind your learner's level of world knowledge, subject matter knowledge, and language knowledge when selecting texts. Let's take a look at criteria for text selection in a bit more detail and see how the text chosen for assessment or instruction purposes vary as the language level of the learners increases. The topic and type of information the task requires can affect the difficulty of the task. If you refer to the CEFR descriptors, you'll see that topics and/or information that are personal, familiar, concrete and not requiring specialised knowledge are easier than those which are unfamiliar and abstract or specialised and which require more difficult or specialised vocabulary and complex grammar. Language also contributes to text difficulty. Texts with structurally simple and short sentences consisting of common everyday words are appropriate lower proficiency levels, for example A1 and A2 on the CEFR. At higher proficiency levels, around C1 and C2, texts with structurally complex and longer sentences, including words with more complex meanings, are appropriate. And when we look at the type of discourse mode, you can see that it will affect the text structure, the writing style, the vocabulary, and possibly the language functions, and thereby pose different challenges for readers. That's why, at lower proficiency levels, such as A1 and A2, for example, appropriate discourse modes are description, narration, for example, a text telling a story of an event, and instruction. Tests set at higher levels, B2, C1 and C2, should challenge the candidates by requiring them to also read and comprehend argumentative texts, which provide views or attitudes on a subject, and expository texts, which define, explain and exemplify a concept, term or phenomenon, for instance, a company merger. Care should be taken with the level of language in any of these modes, and also text structure. For example, narrative texts appropriate for A1 and A2 levels would have a clear narrative and fewer characters. In contrast, narrative texts appropriate for C1 and C2 levels could contain more characters, narrative lines, and/or flashbacks, as these increase text difficulty. These examples illustrate a text with concrete information on the left from an A2 level test and a text with abstract information on the right from a C1 level test. We've looked at texts themselves and how they can differ and so be suitable for different levels. Now let's think about the types of tasks we can use when we're assessing reading comprehension. Task types for reading comprehension texts can be divided into three key groups. The first group is selected response tasks, where a test taker selects an answer from given options, such as multiple choice, multiple matching, true, false, or gapped texts, where the missing word or sentences are provided. Then we have semi-productive tasks, where some limited writing is required. For example, a gapped text where the missing words are not given, or an information transfer task may require chart or label completion or labelling. And thirdly, there are also productive or integrated skills tasks, where it's necessary to read a passage and then write a short or an extended answer, such as a summary or discussion based on that passage. As you can see, there's a wide range of task types that could be used in a test of reading comprehension. This variety in a test is necessary to ensure that all candidates have an opportunity to perform at their best and show that they can use a range of reading skills. Now we've got a task view. Don't worry about reading the text, we're just focusing on the task types here. Look at the two task types on the slide. They're also in your handout. Which task type is this? And it's Participants Activity 6. Bearing the previous list in mind, who can tell us fastest which task type these two tasks or examples are? So is it a selective response task? And if so, which kind? A semi-productive task or a productive task? We've got multiple choice coming through, multiple choice, selective response, multiple choice. It's fairly unanimous. Thank you. These are indeed examples of one of the selected response task types, multiple choice. You can see that there's a difference in the amount of text to read, which is in the red box, in both examples, and the number of answer options in the blue box in both examples. So both text length and text density are different according to the level. The task on the right from a B2 level test poses a higher reading challenge than the task on the left, which is from an A2 level test, and requires a wider range of reading skills. So once again, here are two tasks using the same task type at different levels. They're on your handout as well. That's Participants Activity 7. Who can tell us which task type this is? Please write the answer in the chat box. So which task type is it? It's a gap fill, very good. Gap filling.
Semi-productive, exactly.
Gap filling, semi-productive, yes, semi-productive. Again, fairly unanimous. Thank you. Yes, they're both gapped text tasks. The one on the left is an open-close from an A2 level test, where candidates have to complete the sentence with the missing words, whereas the one on the right is an extract from a gapped text with paragraphs removed and placed after the text in jumbled order from a C2 level test. Now let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of a few task types. We'll start with multiple choice questions. If you'd like to look at an example of this, there are two on your handout. Which task type is this? Take a look at Participants Activity number 6. Multiple choice questions are frequently used in tests of reading comprehension around the world. They're easy to administer and mark, given that the candidates only select a response from a given set of options. As there's no writing involved and answer options are given, they are objectively marked as right or wrong. They allow a coverage of a wide range of reading skills or task focuses. For example, they're appropriate for testing comprehension of detail, as well as comprehension of main ideas or gist, comprehension of explicit, as well as implicit meaning. They could also be used to test careful as well as fast reading. However, there are some disadvantages. Given that they require selection from a given set of options rather than writing an open-ended or semi-controlled response, they test only receptive skills and are open to guessing. Also, they're not representative of how we engage with reading tasks in real life. For that reason, they may have a negative impact on teaching and learning. For example, instead of focusing on improving their reading skills, learners may focus on how to do multiple choice tasks the best. Information transfer tasks require limited writing. See the example in the handout, pros and cons. These could come close to real-life tasks in some academic or workplace contexts. Table and chart completion or labelling parts requires comprehension of steps in a process, classification system, or comprehension of the sequence of events in a story. However, such tasks must be presented with clear guidance for how the task should be completed. For example, does one need to write one word or a phrase in each space? Learners should also be informed of scoring criteria. For instance, will they be penalised for misspelling? This means that the task needs to be very carefully thought through. Integrated skills tasks, and as an example on the handout, pros and cons again, are very realistic. Fairly often in our private, professional or academic lives, we read something and then discuss it with someone else, or write about something we have read. For this reason, such tasks could be motivating, and they also require engaging a variety of reading skills and cognitive processes. For example, you need to understand detail, main points, gist and implication, and comprehend across sentences and the entire text in order to be able to summarise or discuss what was read. The task feels like an integral part of learning and can be used in class. However, assessing reading comprehension through such tasks is inefficient for several reasons. Extended responses take a long time to rate, and time is needed to develop assessment criteria and descriptors of performance, and to make sure that teacher examiners rate reliably, given that subjective judgment is involved. In addition, reading comprehension is assessed through writing, and it may not be easy to separate comprehension ability from writing ability when giving your learner diagnostic feedback on what exactly they should improve.
So, in summary, we can see that there is no best way to test reading comprehension. Each task type has its own advantages and disadvantages, and each is suitable for different purposes. Ideally, a test should use a variety of task types so that no candidates get an unfair advantage or a disadvantage, and so that you can cover a broad range of reading skills. And here are some final points that you need to consider when developing or choosing tasks. Firstly, are tasks at the right level of difficulty for your learners? We have already discussed factors which influence task difficulty. Secondly, are the instructions to the task clear? If the instructions are not clear, the task may not assess the skills that it is designed to test. For example, learners should know if certain tasks are timed or not, or whether they are assessed on the language they produce in responding to reading comprehension questions. Another consideration is there a range of tasks in the test? As we've seen, different task types have different strengths and limitations, so including a range of task types would minimize limitations and optimize the strengths. What is the order of tasks? It is important to start with easier tasks and then move on to more difficult ones. It is also advisable for questions to follow the order in which information is presented in the passage, if you test careful and linear reading, for example. Then, what is the timing for each part of the test? You need to consider how long each task is, whether you want to time a task to ensure you assess fast reading, and also whether you're going to include any planning time in case an extended response is required in a reading comprehension task. Finally, are the scoring or marking criteria clear to the test takers? It is important to tell your students how you're going to score the tests so they know if their spelling is assessed, for example, or if some questions and tasks are worth more than the others. Giving them this information will make it a fairer test, and we will talk about scoring next.
So far, we've talked about what reading is and what considerations we should have in mind for text and task type selection. Now let's think about how we go about scoring the reading which the task has generated, and the assessment criteria to use. So how can we score reading tasks? Think about a multiple choice question. What score would you give a correct answer? What score would you give an incorrect answer? Please type your responses in the chat box now. So scoring. So what would you give a correct answer and what would you give an incorrect answer? Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Katerina says 1 point. Victoria 1 point. 1 and 0. 2 to 1. Somebody says depends on the... I missed it. But it does depend on things. A correct answer 1. So people are definitely saying incorrect at 0. And correct answer 1, but it does depend. And that's right. An incorrect answer would score 0. But we can decide to award 1 mark or 2 marks, for example, to a correct answer. We can give every correct answer the same score, or we can use weighting to make some questions worth more than others. Differences in weighting should reflect differences in task demands and difficulty. Otherwise, everything could be single weighted if we believe that all answers and skills are equal for our assessment purposes. We can give guidance to markers and test takers about what spelling to accept as correct. For example, maybe alternative British and American spelling and whether spelling must be correct for marks to be awarded. We can also give guidance to markers about punctuation and grammar, not to penalise for incorrect use of capitalisation, for example, or whether correct grammar is required. This is essential for ensuring that test scoring is reliable.
Let's summarise what we've discussed so far. We looked at different factors that should be borne in mind when making decisions on what you want to test, how you want to test it, and how you want to score it. This discussion is ultimately important for creating a fair and relevant test of reading comprehension for your learners. We have also provided a few tips for teaching and practicing reading comprehension. So here are the key messages. You should first decide on your test construct. What are you trying to test? Which aspect or aspects of reading ability? Is this appropriate for your learners, for their level of language proficiency and real-life needs? You should then make sure you select task types that are matched to what you want to assess. Text should be selected with task type and test construct in mind. Then you need to be very clear about scoring criteria so that you and your markers can reliably score responses and so the test takers know what they are assessed on. Next, you should decide on timing and communicate the timing of the overall test, or of each test part if relevant, to your test takers and those who administer your test. All of these factors will make the test more objective and fairer to your students. We've now come to the end of the main webinar, and in a moment Dennis and I will answer any questions you may have. So here are some questions that were sent in by some of you. So Dennis, I saw one inquiring about how can we include all the information that is necessary to achieve test fairness and clarity on scoring, etc., etc., and yet keep the instructions reasonably concise and short?
Well, I think that it's of paramount importance that candidates know how, the score for each correct answer, and that should be on the paper. I think things like spelling and sort of areas like that, whether spelling needs to be correct or not, perhaps could be made clear at the beginning of the paper. And also, of course, I think if you're in an exam course, then you'll be well aware of that, and it should be available on the website whether you need to spell things correctly or not.
I agree. Yeah, some of this information should definitely be present out there, either in hard copy or online form for test takers to familiarize themselves with before the actual test, months and days and who knows what. But yeah, some nitty-gritty information should be there in task instructions.
There was one question that caught my eye about whether it was a good idea to have a reading test solely made up of multiple choice questions.
Well, I thought that we kind of answered that question already. not only multiple choice. Multiple choice are useful to a certain extent because, as we said, they can test a variety of reading skills and they're very, very efficient. I mean, you can just easily turn around the test, get the marks, get the scores out. But if you test only through multiple choice, you may end up having negative impact on the learners who may then be just taught to kind of either guess or strategically look for responses, and then you avoid kind of testing some other skills.
Yeah, there needs to be a range of item types, really, doesn't
Exactly. There was another question in relation to this, maybe, which was asking us about how we see the value of translation as a task or a set of tasks that could be used to promote reading comprehension or to practice reading comprehension. And my view is there is some value in it, but I would say it's limited because when you translate, okay, you should understand the text in depth. And you can't translate if you don't understand it in such a way, which means that in order to translate something, and we're not talking about simultaneous interpreting here, you should be able to read carefully and for detail. And so that's only one type of reading that we covered, and there are so many more, like fast reading and selective reading, which you will really, really need in real life, regardless of whether you're at a train station or at a university course where you have to kind of really read a lot of material within a limited space of time.
And of course, translation's an art form as well. I mean, some
Exactly.
people, are using different skills, writing skills, to make their translation the most palatable for their readers. And perhaps it's something we want to move away from anyway, because there's an element of decoding in
true.
translation.
I mean, yeah, by all means, you can use it, but please be careful about how you use it. And I wanted to add, I mean, I think when we are starting to learn a new language, we have probably all been guilty of trying to translate what we are reading in our mother tongue and then translate it back into English or whichever language we are reading into. And yes, we should definitely move away from the mediation of your mother tongue or any dominant language you have, and try to kind of make the process as automatic and as natural, as spontaneous as possible. So I'm just trying to identify a few more. How can I encourage extended reading? I think the key is to have a good library at school or at the language center where you're teaching.
There was one contributor who mentioned that millennials are reading a lot less, and perhaps how's that affecting reading assessment? I mean, surely reading is still a very important skill and needs to be tested within a test of language ability, but it is interesting that people are reading less, or are they? I don't know.
So
they're
that's
reading
a good
different
question.
genres less.
I think I would say they're still probably reading a lot, because you can see people on the commuter trains kind of constantly glued to their iPhones or iPads.
Are they reading now?
Or even are they reading? Well, that's a good question. But maybe it's just a matter of what genres, what text types do you read? What are the styles of those text types? And with the technology, new technology out there, like some of these things, if necessary, could also be incorporated in assessment, computer-based assessment, for example.
And in our work lives and academic lives, we are reading at least as much as we have always been, if not more, I think. I certainly do a lot of reading.
Yeah, simply because many more materials are available to us, just a stone throw away. Again, somebody's a bit unclear about the difference between skimming and scanning, and I'd say when you skim, so both are selective reading, fast and selective reading, so you don't read everything and you just avoid what you think is not relevant for your question or questions. But skimming is more about getting the gist of the text, so the main idea, the main message.
It's like scooping up little bits of meaning at the surface of
just
the text.
Imagine a bird
like skimming
flying
a stone
across,
or
skimming a stone on the water, exactly.
Whereas scanning
is more about searching for kind of exact words you may be looking. For example, if you're looking for a mention of a specific currency in a text, then you will look for the symbol of that currency.
And not be distracted by any meaning-related issues in between that scanning.
Exactly.
I hope that makes it clear.
I hope so.
It says here, what do you think of simplified readers? I think that anything that encourages people to read is a good thing, but I think that it's a good entry, it's a good gateway at the lower levels at A1 and A2. But I think that we should be encouraging our students to read once they're able to, so that obviously they don't want to get discouraged once they're able to read the not simplified text, the original texts, because I think that's one of the beauties of knowing a different language, really, a sort of entree into another world of literature.
It's true. I saw some comments in relation to this that teachers are finding it difficult or challenging to find authentic texts which are suitable enough for A1 or A2 level. And yes, I agree, it may be a challenge really. And yes, you should use some adapted text or simplified text. And maybe what you could do perhaps is pick something that they think they may understand and you adapt it yourself, provided you have the time. Otherwise, try to think outside the box a bit and use what is already out there and available. For example, some street signs or messages or notes, brief notes that could be used in their authentic form for lower level readers.
Certainly, as teachers these days, we've got so much more access to authentic material online. Really, when I started teaching, you were somewhere teaching in the world, and your choices for authentic material were very, very limited. But now there's so much available.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, we have run out of time.
Oh dear.
Yeah, we could stay here.
We could stay
for
here
another hour.
Longer, yeah.
But if you have any further queries which are exam related, then please drop us a line and we'll be happy to respond.
Yeah, more than happy.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Take care now.